Put that there just in case. I've got my own. All right. All right. All right. Greetings. I hope everyone is well this morning. Welcome to the Understanding the Holocaust Assembly. Our goal is to have you leave this assembly better informed about what the Holocaust was, the historical context in which it occurred, and its continuing relevance. Rebecca, Maya, Paige, and Rabbi Kaplan will be speaking in turn on these issues. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge some people whose work made this assembly possible. I would like to thank Steve Foldis, class of 1966, for his commitment to bringing Holocaust education to his alma mater. Carly Orshon, director of the Teen Division at the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, for materials used by history and social science teachers in relation to this assembly. And Cheryl Connolly, Wyoming Seminary's Director of Advancement, for coordinating the effort to organize this assembly. Additionally, I would like to thank Mrs. Bartron, Mix Penland, Ms. Twardowski, and Mr. Doherty for helping get this assembly on the schedule, Mr. Bussey for setting everything up, and Paul Stevenson for his help in organizing our student speakers. As is so often the case at Wyoming Seminary, this assembly is truly a team effort. Without further ado, let's turn our attention to understanding the Holocaust.
I'm Rebecca, by the way, if that wasn't obvious. So April is Genocide Awareness Month, and genocide has been defined variously through the 8 decades since the Polish legal scholar Raphael Lemkin coined the term in 1944. Largely in response to mass killings in German-occupied Europe during World War II. These definitions share a few basic ideas. Genocide consists of a deliberate, coordinated action undertaken by a dominant group in society, often through its control of state institutions for the purpose of destroying a marginalized group in that society through mass killings, forced migrations, and various other means. April was chosen as Genocide Awareness Month because of its association with several 20th century genocidal episodes. The Tutsi genocide in Rwanda in 1994 is commemorated on April 7th. The Cambodian genocide of 1975 to 1979 is remembered on April 17th. And the Armenian genocide of 1915 is commemorated on April 24th. Yom HaShoah, which commemorates the Holocaust, falls in April or May, depending on the year. This year, it falls on May 5th. Today, our focus is on the Holocaust, which is perhaps the archetypal genocide. Let us begin by placing it in historical context. The Holocaust roots lay in a series of interrelated developments during the late 19th century. First, nationalistic modes of thinking had gained widespread acceptance in European societies during this period. Nationalism posed that humanity is divided into distinct groups called nations, often defined by a shared history and culture, and that nations ought to live in their own nation state, a sovereign political unit that promoted the well-being of the nation inside its borders and within a competitive international environment. Nationalists viewed the world through an us versus them lens, and they often viewed ethnic and religious minorities living within a nation state as marginalized others who did not belong to that nation and whose existence constituted a threat to the country and its people. The second development was the prevalent belief among educated Europeans in a debunked form of the biological sciences we today called scientific racism, which I know a lot of you have learned about in AP World, because I did as well. Scientific racism asserted that humanity was divided into distinct racial groups, distinguished by identifiable characteristics that made each group more or less successful in an evolutionary competition for power and wealth within societies and within the global world. On this basis, scientific racists posed a racial hierarchy in which superior groups, such as white Europeans, dominated all the others. Scientific racism inspired concerns about the racial and ethnic purity of populations. From this perspective, marginalized others were viewed as inherently inferior people polluting the nation, and thus discriminatory policies towards them were justified. Oh my gosh, excuse me. Third, nationalistic modes of thinking and scientific racism transformed anti-Semitism in European societies. Anti-Semitism, defined broadly as hostility toward and prejudice toward against Jewish people, had existed in European societies for centuries, but it was largely expressed in terms of religion and economic resentment. The anti-Semitism of the late 19th century and beyond was different, for it defined Jews primarily as ethnic outsiders, unworthy of inclusion in the nation, and as racial inferiors whose subhumanity could not be rectified by religious conversion. These transformations left European Jews as a nationless and stateless people in an era which European societies were experiencing significant socioeconomic and political changes. They amplified traditional expressions of anti-Semitism and gave rise to a politicized anti-Semitism across the continent, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Anti-Semitism political parties and associations emerged in several countries, and Jews in Russia, Romania, and elsewhere in Eastern Europe were subjected to waves of violent pogroms. Thousands of Jews emigrated from Europe, and Zionism, the movement to create a Jewish national state, emerged within the increasingly hostile environment Jews faced in the late 19th century Europe. And now I will hand it off to Maya.
The more immediate context for the Holocaust was the Nazi seizure of power in Germany in 1932 to 33. The National Socialist German Workers' Party was not the first avowedly anti-Semitic political party in Europe, but it was the most successful in terms of gaining power and implementing policy. Their program blended exclusionary nationalism and scientific racism into a virulent, politicized anti-Semitism. Largely ignored by the German electorate through the 1920s, the Nazis gained ground rapidly as the social and economic consequences of the Great Depression destabilized Germany's democratic government. By winning a plurality in consecutive elections in 1932 and 1933, and through effective demonstrations of force, the Nazis ended German democracy and embarked on a revolutionary program to transform the country. Viewing Jews as racial inferiors and desiring their exclusion from the German nation, the Nazis enacted discriminatory policies against them from 1933 onward. Nazi legislation curtailed Jewish economic rights by limiting or forbidding them from participating in many professions, transferring Jewish-owned businesses to non-Jewish proprietors, and eventually confiscating the property and assets belonging to Jews. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 deprived Jews of citizenship within Germany and forbade Jews to marry non-Jewish Germans. Other decrees systemically excluded Jews from various areas of social life, thus segregating them within German society. Increasingly draconian restrictions, the daily indignities of life under an avowedly hostile regime, and violence such as the Kristallnacht pogrom in 1938 pushed German Jews to emigrate from their homeland in growing numbers as the 1930s progressed. The situation of Jews in Germany and elsewhere in Europe deteriorated during the initial years of World War II. German armies established control over much of continental Europe between the invasion of Poland in September of 1939 and their defeat at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 43. Jews in occupied Eastern Europe were forcibly concentrated into ghettos as German armies established control over the region, segregating them from other populations while plans to remove them from German-occupied territory were made. Jews in German-occupied Western Europe were subject to discriminatory laws, but the process of deporting them eastward en masse was delayed until 1942. Mass killings of Jews began following the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, and Nazi officials adopted the final solution of exterminating the Jewish populations under German jurisdiction at the Wannsee Conference in January of 1942. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 6 million Jews were killed in German-occupied territories. These killings happened through several modalities. The systemic transport of large numbers of Jews to extermination centers, labor and concentration camps, and ghettos is the most well-known strategy for mass extermination, and with good reason. 2.7 million Jews died in extermination centers, with the Auschwitz complex accounting for 1 million victims. Another 800,000 to 1 million Jews died through subjection to extraordinarily harsh conditions in labor and concentration camps and in ghettos. Outside of this industrial extermination complex, 2 million Jews were murdered through mass shootings carried out by German soldiers and police units, often aided by local collaborators in occupied territory in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Almost 24,000 Jews were massacred in this way at Kamets-Podolsk in August of 1941, and 34,000 more were shot to death at Babin Yar 1 month later. There were also mass killings through communal violence, such as the massacre of several hundred Jews at Jedwabne, Poland in July of 1941. In these cases, local populations murdered Jews in their community, either under the encouragement of occupying German armies or of their own volition. All told, approximately 2/3 of Eastern European Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And now I'll pass it over to Paige.
As Jewish communities became aware of the Nazi extermination program, they organized resistance to it. Resistance strategies ranged from bargaining with Nazi officials to flight to armed resistance. Bargaining was a generally unsuccessful strategy given the Nazi goal of destroying Europe's Jewish population, but it seems to have played a role in preserving some Jewish communities. Flight was a viable option for those living near areas beyond German control, and Jews formed organizations dedicated to helping their co-religionists escape the Nazi genocidal program in many countries. Cooperation between the Bratislava-based working group, the Aid and Rescue Committee centered in Budapest, and Polish Zionist youth groups helped 13,000 Jews escape to Hungary during the middle years of the war. After German soldiers occupied Hungary in 1944, the Aid and Rescue Committee organized a movement of 7,000 Jews from Hungary to Romania. Heroic efforts of this sort saved the lives of tens of thousands of Jews during the war. Armed resistance included uprisings within labor and extermination camps, joining anti-German resistance organizations, and armed resistance by populations concentrated into ghettos. The most famous episode of armed resistance was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which began 81 years ago today. German authorities had deported upwards of 250,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka extermination camp in 1942. When a second wave of deportations began in 1943, approximately 750 armed Jews formed two resistance groups, the Jewish Combat Organization and the Jewish Military Union, rose up and resisted German forces for nearly 1 month before succumbing. The Warsaw Ghetto was liquidated, and its 50,000 remaining inhabitants were sent to extermination camps by the end of May 1943. In this sense, the uprising failed. But this resistance had great symbolic meaning. In the words of resistance leader Mordecai Anelowitz, "My life's dream has now been realized. Jewish self-defense in the ghetto is now an accomplished fact. I have been witness to the magnificent, heroic struggle of the Jewish fighters." The victory of the Allied powers ended the Holocaust. British and Soviet authorities had been aware of the mass killings of Jews by the Nazis since the summer of 1941, and American officials learned of them shortly after this. British and American leaders believed that their central war aim was to defeat the Axis powers, and that the best way to help the Jews in German-occupied territories was to win the war as quickly as possible. Consequently, they undertook no sustained effort to rescue European Jews. As Allied forces liberated labor, concentration, and extermination camps in 1945, they confronted the full measure of Nazi atrocities. The Holocaust had immediate repercussions. Several Nazi officials were convicted of war crimes by the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg by 1946. The newly formed United Nations recognized genocide as a crime in 1946 and adopted its Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide 2 years later. In that same year, 1948, the UN oversaw the formation of a Jewish national state, Israel. The Holocaust continues to reverberate today through numerous memorials that commemorate its victims and museums that educate visitors about it, through artistic depictions that reflect on it, through the work of scholars whose research seeks greater understanding of it, and through the work of organizations dedicated to combating anti-Semitism and other forms of hate-based belief systems in an effort to prevent future crimes against humanity. We are honored today to have Rabbi Larry Kaplan here with us to speak about the broader significance of the Holocaust. A native of Philadelphia, Rabbi Kaplan did his undergraduate studies at Brandeis University and earned his master's degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. An ordained rabbi, he served synagogues in Hartford and Miami before taking the pulpit of Temple Israel in Wilkes-Barre. Extraordinarily active in community service in the greater Wilkes-Barre area, Rabbi Kaplan has also taught courses at King's College, Misericordia University, and Wyoming Seminary. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Kaplan.
I appreciate the honor of being here, and I'll be honest with you, I'd much rather be talking about something fun. I also have a bit of an issue because I can't really see you well, so it's really tough for me to tell who's still awake. But I'm going to try to keep you going. I really only have a relatively few comments, essentially four points that I want to make. And I appreciate the overview. Ladies, you did a great job. It was really a lot of information packed into a very short amount of time. If you really want to study the Holocaust and all of its inner workings, you'd probably only have to read about, I don't know, 2,000, maybe 3,000 different books that have been written on it, and listen to days and days and days worth of videos and movies and firsthand accounts and everything else, and then all of the survivors of the Holocaust and their stories, which could take quite a long time to go through. So to get it down into a few minutes is really a good thing. But it's also a good thing that Wyoming Seminary has decided to do a program like this, and our thanks go out also to Steve Foldis, an alum of seminary, who doesn't even live here anymore, but wants to make sure that every generation knows the horror of the Holocaust. We have been saying for a long time, never again. We're not going to let this happen again. And we really haven't figured out as a world how to make sure that it doesn't happen. Anyway, here are the 4 points. The Germans. How could they become Nazis? What was it that dragged them into it? Or did they go with open minds? Did they want to be part of Nazism? Number 2, aren't we as human beings basically good? Where does the evil come from? Number 3, what are the demographics involved? Why all of this concentration on Jews? Is it that they are such a huge part of society? Is it that they make more trouble than most other people do? Why why constantly are we focusing on Jews? And then the last thing is, can't we just forgive and forget? I mean, the German government certainly has done plenty with reparations and things like that. I was amazed when I lived in Israel. I lived in Israel for 2 years during one my junior year in college and one at rabbinical school. And all of the buses and taxis were German-made. They were Mercedes or some other BMW, something like that. And I'm thinking, don't the Jew, why would all these Jews in the entire state of Israel be driving around in what we consider fancy cars, but it was just, that was what it was. All the buses had the insignia of Mercedes-Benz on it. Would you feel comfortable with that? Wouldn't you say, I'm not buying anything that's German after what Germany did to 6 million Jews? And part of it was, well, if the Germans, through reparations, are giving you a really good break on buying buses that are produced in Germany, well, then you're going to use it. But part of it was we have to move on. We have to keep living. And that's the greatest thing we can do to counteract Hitler, to still be alive, to still be having babies, and to still be moving forward. So number one, Germany was probably the highest cultured place in the world at the time of World War II. There was a great deal of precision in Germany. I worked with a German rabbi in an earlier pulpit. I was an associate rabbi to a fellow named Hans Siegfried Bodenheimer. And Rabbi Bodenheimer was German through and through. When I was in charge of the religious school and was putting up some Israeli flags in the religious school, he said, "Don't put up Israeli flags. What do we need to do with Israel? We need to, first of all, we're American," and he was a staunch supporter of American liberalism, and FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was his hero, and Rabbi Bodenheimer was called back to Germany almost every year to visit one of the places that he worked in as a rabbi. He was on a circuit. He would do bar mitzvah training in small little villages all around Germany. And he still loved his German background. He really did. And it was interesting because he was so proud of it, despite the horror and the terror that happened. Rabbi Bodenheimer's synagogue was in flames in 1938 during that fateful day in November called Kristallnacht. Why Kristallnacht? Nacht is night, and Kristall is glass. It was the night of the broken glass. And all throughout Germany, there were pogroms where storefronts and buildings and homes were smashed. There was glass all over the place, and synagogues were burned down. Beautiful, magnificent synagogues were burned down. The Jewish life in Germany had been there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Jews were living in Germany long before Hitler's family was, but it didn't matter. All that history didn't matter. What mattered was that there was this huge force to anti-Semitism, to hate the Jews, and to show that they weren't worthy of being able to have their places of worship. And so they were bombed and burned. His wife of blessed memory, well, he of blessed memory as well, he's long since passed, his wife ran into the burning building and took one of the Torah scrolls out of the ark and saved it from the flames. Now, if you want to see a Torah that was saved from the Holocaust, the Jewish Community Center right here in town has one in a beautiful glass presentation case that was saved from the Holocaust and is holding on to it, obviously. But those kinds of things happened. The Nuremberg laws that were mentioned already, they actually happened. But what were those laws? They were declared as the laws for the protection and honor of German blood. It was about blood. It really was. It was about what's going to be the purest blood for a future of Germany. It's a big question, this whole thing with blood. And it meant that blood needed to be spilled if the blood wasn't pure. And Hitler and the folks that he convinced about it believed that we needed purity. We needed Übermenschen. We needed supermen, right? And the only way to get that is to have pure Aryan blood. And anyone who didn't look the part, and anyone who didn't have the genes, the blood, needed to be set aside, gotten rid of, or killed. And that is something that was born out of science. That's one of the scariest parts of all this. America at the time, in the a little bit earlier, in the 1920s, was dabbling a great deal with genetics. Not genetics to find help for mutations that cause fetal anomalies and things like that, but genetics meaning, well, you don't have the right genes, let's stop this. And there was a huge program of making undesirables infertile so that they couldn't bring about the next generation. And that was on racial terms here in the United States. And the Germans saw what was going on scientifically, and they borrowed the idea and continued the technology. And this time it was going to be for those who didn't fit into that pure white Aryan mold. In 1939, a ship left Hamburg with about 1,000 Jews on it. Two of them were the parents of attorney David Schwager, who is also an alum of Wyoming Seminary, and he often speaks about his own personal experience, which he learned from his parents. So they were on this ship. It was called the St. Louis, and it was out of Hamburg. And the folks in 1939 in Germany knew what was going on already. They had already had Yud, Jew, painted on the glass that was still left of their businesses, their tailor shops, their factories and things like that. They saw what was coming, and they knew they couldn't stop it. And so they wanted to leave. And at that point, they still could. And so 900 and some, almost 1,000 Jews were on this ship. They paid for passage, and they had visas, entry visas for Cuba, for Havana. When the ship got to the port in Havana, it was turned away, and the Jews weren't able to disembark. And so they headed for the United States, and you see how liberal our immigration policies are. You've been part of all this, wanting to increase the number who are able to come to America and enjoy the freedom here. You see the difficulties, the clashes between those who say no more undocumented immigrants, and others who say, come on, where's your compassion? Where's your concern for humanity? Let them in, right? Well, America wasn't exactly in that mode back then. And while President Franklin Roosevelt was very progressive in many ways, when it came to immigration, they weren't. I think they were only letting something like 15,000 in a year of immigrants in general, legal immigrants. And the ship was turned away from American ports down in Florida. So they headed up to Canada, and it was turned away from there as well. And it headed back to Germany. And hundreds of the passengers said, we're gonna drown ourselves. We're not going back to Germany. And the ship captain, a German, but a German with a great deal of compassion, found a way to get the ship into Belgium, and many of the passengers were able to disembark and move to Belgium and France and England, even France that had already been overtaken by the Germans. And the rest of them were sent back to Germany and were ultimately killed in the death camps. So David's parents survived, and they made it back to America, and that's a personal story. Why didn't Hitler send all of his Jews away? Why not? Wouldn't that have been the best thing to do? Wouldn't that have been the easiest thing to do? He did want to. That's just it. Why else would the Holocaust have been called the final solution? Because there were other attempted solutions to get rid of the Jews, and nobody wanted them. So he needed to come up with something to be able to have his Übermenschen, his super race. He didn't plan genocide. He just wanted to get the Jews out, along with many other people. Don't forget, 6 million Jews, but 12 million died in the Holocaust. And many of them were just minorities from other groups. If their skin was the wrong color, if their background was the wrong kind, if they believed differently, if they were wanderers like Roma, they were targeted. If they didn't fit into the sexual ideal, heterosexual ideal, then they were deemed defective and needed to be killed ultimately. And so the idea of the concentration camps and the death camps. And what was part of all of that? What did you hear when you came into Auschwitz, for example, as a new resident coming off the cattle cars? What did you hear? You heard orchestral music. You heard the great German composers as you were getting off of that train. Why? Because the Germans were highly cultured. They were highly educated. And that just meant that they had easier ways of killing. The culture, the education doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make you a more moral human being. And so there was music. And they convinced a number of Jews to help them out. Look, when you know that there are crematoria and gas chambers in the same place that you're living, and that at any moment you could be chosen for that ultimate end, and then a German soldier comes over and says, I want you to work for me. You're going to help round up these Jews. You're going to make sure that anyone who tries to organize anything against the soldiers, you're going to let us know first, and we'll save your life. They were called kapos, and they were Jews turning in their fellow Jews. Meanwhile, there were Christians and non-religious Germans that were saving Jews at the same time all around Germany. Not huge numbers, but enough that knew that what was happening was wrong. And even though it was a capital offense to save a Jew or to hide a Jew, many, they're called righteous Gentiles. There's a whole section in the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum and in Jerusalem dedicated to the righteous Gentiles. And again, they weren't all Gentiles. Some just weren't anything. But they weren't Jews. And they put their lives and their families' lives on the line in order to save them. You heard of, who was that young woman who was saved by, you probably read her book. Anyone remember? Anne Frank, right? Anne Frank, an amazing girl at 12, right around bat mitzvah age, and she wrote about it in her diary. And we have that diary. And so this brings us to the second point. Are we basically good? What did Anne Frank say? She said, despite it all, I believe that we're all basically good, that humanity is good, that there's hope because we are good. So let me ask you, raise your hand, not that I can see them, but raise it anyway, if you think that we are basically good. Okay, anyone think that we are basically inherently bad? A couple of you, okay. Well, what is it? What are we? So if you go into the Bible, I can say Bible here, can I? Okay, it's not public school. If you go into the Bible in the story of Genesis, at the end of the Noah story, remember Noah and the flood, the whole thing there? At the very end, God puts a sign in the sky that essentially is never going to destroy the world again by a flood. Just Wilkes-Barre, right? What's the sign in the sky? The rainbow, okay? And he said, I'm never going to destroy the world again. Here's my bow in the sky, and that's a promise. And then he says, the Bible says in Hebrew, Ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra min urav. Because the inclination of a person's heart is ra, is bad from their youth. The inclination of our hearts is toward bad from our youth. What the heck does that mean? Do babies come out bad? Have you ever been woken up at 3 in the morning by a screaming baby? How many of you have? Well, I certainly have. And somehow babies are able to wake you up. Even through thick walls, you can hear them. It's like they've swallowed an air horn, right? And that's what. And what would happen if they just kind of sat in their crib and looked at their mom, who was exhausted, and said, you know what, you need your rest. I'm gonna just sit here and play with these colored plastic things, and my diaper's kind of full, and I'm a little hungry, and I'd really like to be held right now, but you need your rest, right? Wouldn't that be a good baby, right? So is the screaming baby bad? No, of course not. The screaming baby is natural. The screaming baby is doing what it needs to do in order to what? In order to survive, in order to live. So being essentially a cute little blob of selfishness, right, is the way it needs to be, so that we know when they need something. I just like to be able to hand it, you know, a pen and some paper and let them just tell me what it is. Because what happens is you end up picking up that baby, that crying, screaming baby, and you go like this, and now it's screaming right into your ear, right? So it doesn't get any better. And you change it, and you hold it, and you feed it, and you do all these things to it, and it's still screaming. As if it's saying, I want to be fed, I want to be held, I want to be nurtured, I want to be rocked. I don't know what I want, but if you don't do it for me immediately, I'm going to make your life miserable, right? That's what babies do. They're innocent, but they're selfish. What is the process by which humans are supposed to become less and less selfish and more selfless, more aware of the needs of others around them? What's that called, that process? It's called maturity. What happens if you don't mature? What happens if you're a teenager and you still won't share and you still don't care about anybody else? What happens if you're a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old or a statesman or the leader of a people like Hitler was, who is consumed with what? Did he wake up in the morning and say, what evil, antisocial, horrible thing can I do today to the world? How many of you think Hitler woke up and said that? I mean, maybe he's just a sociopath. Maybe he had no sense of morality, no ability to control his evil. Or did he wake up and say, I want to make my people the greatest people on earth. We're going to make these Ubermenschen. We're going to have supermen. We're going to be the greatest state, the greatest country, all for the fatherland, right? Are those evil thoughts? Not unless you're going to put them in action by killing millions and millions of people or enslaving them or whatever it is that you really want to accomplish. It's a real problem. And it's based ultimately on selfishness. If we're selfish, we're only concerned with what we want. If we're humane, we care about others. And that's what was lacking, even in these highly cultured, highly educated German people. It is in our nature to be selfish. And Anne Frank was a lovely, wonderful young person who didn't get it. Like many of us, we don't get it. We just assume whatever we do wrong is the fault of somebody else. It's not us. Well, you can't get a master race by being concerned with every other race. So it's a problem. Let's go to demographics for a minute. How many people on the planet? Who's counted? About 7.5 billion. How much is a billion? 1,000 million is a billion. So 7.5 billion people on the planet. About 2 billion Christians, maybe 2.3 or so. How many Muslims? Yeah, well, if you look at the statistics online, Dr. Albecki spoke to some of you guys. An amazing guy. He's one of the imams at the mosque, and I work with him. I'm one of the chaplains at the VA hospital, and he's a physician there. An amazing, amazing person, Dr. Albecki. And he's told me 1.6, 1.8 billion. But the latest statistics I saw, checked the Google before. You ever heard of that? It's an amazing tool. About 1.9, and it's going to be close to 2 billion, okay? So that means if there's only 7.5 billion and over 2 billion are Christians, Catholics and Protestants, and almost 2 billion are Muslims, that's already up to 4. Another billion Hindus, right? That's 5. Another billion that are, well, nuns. I don't mean Catholic nuns. I mean, when they ask, do you have a religion? None, right? And that's a growing group, right? And then there's others that are in the 500,000s or so. How many Jews? How many? About 14 to 15 million. But that also includes a non-Jewish parent who is schlepping the kid to bar mitzvah lessons, okay? And is there for the family and is supporting the family, but isn't really a Jew, hasn't officially converted or something like that. So maybe 14, 15 million. How many Jews were living in the world in 1939? Close to 17 to 18 million, all right? So Hitler takes out 6 million, including 1.5 million children, and Jews have been trying to get the numbers back. Well, I don't think they've been trying very hard. The average birth rate among Jews is about 2.2, and the 0.2 doesn't look that great, I got to tell you. But no, seriously, it's been a difficulty because as you become upwardly mobile, you just end up not having as many kids. It's just the way it works. You know, you want to be able to fit into a booth when you eat out. I mean, there's some practical things involved in this, okay? So Jews have not replenished themselves sufficiently to even make up for what Hitler did, okay? So we're back to about 15 million or so, 7 million over in Israel, another 6.5 to 7 million here and in Europe, and a lot of them are leaving Europe because Second World War and the Holocaust happened a long time ago, and it really has never fully ended. Anti-Semitism is on the rise all around the world, and it was on the rise long before October 7th happened, and that, of course, has increased the number of those who want to get rid of the Jews. And I understand it. I mean, I understand the concept. I don't exactly know exactly what we've done wrong, but I will tell you that there aren't a lot of Jews in the world. I mean, if there's 2 billion, 1,000 million Muslims, then what's 1% of the Muslims? How many people is that? It's 18, if it's 1.8 billion, it's 18 million people, okay? 18 million, well, 18 million people is more than 15 million people. So what's 1% of the Jews? Me, and you two, you know, whatever. I mean, that's it. We're small. It's a small number. We have big mouths. I'm telling you, seriously. You walk into a Jewish restaurant on the Lower East Side, it's going to be very noisy. All right? There's a tradition. I'm allowed to do this because I'm Jewish, been Jewish my whole life. I can say these things. And there are actually things that are true about it. We don't have to be self-deprecating, but there's just some things about it, you know. If you're called the chosen people enough, right, then you don't give the chosen people a bad potato, you know. I want to see the manager, and and everything like that. There's a lot of complaining. You know, what do we call complaining in Yiddish? Kvetching. Have you heard that word? A lot of kvetching, a lot of complaints. None in my synagogue, of course, but there's a lot of complaints going on, okay? And the truth is that there's a lot to complain about. But we still need to move forward. We still need to move on. We still need to have tenacity. This is not the first time, this Holocaust, the Jews have been exterminated, and it's not the first time the Jews have been kicked out. They've been kicked out of almost every country, every place that they've ever lived in. And it's been a problem. How many of you saw Fiddler on the Roof? If you haven't seen it, you want to get an idea of what Judaism was like in the 1850s, 1880s, in the shtetl in Eastern Europe where they were poor as dirt, okay? Watch the movie. What's the last scene? The last scene is Anatevka, where they're kicked out of this town that they were living in for hundreds of years. And what do they say? They say, what are we leaving behind? A pot, a bench, a chair. We'll find it again. We'll make new stuff. We'll do it somewhere else. And after the Holocaust, when they were able to get to Israel, it's the first time in thousands of years that the Jews have had a place that they can say, we can defend ourselves in this place. And that's why it became so important. That's why Zionism became so important. I have suggested, not that they call me, Netanyahu has not been on the phone with me, but if he were, I'd said the Jews should move to Montana. The Israelis should pick up and move to Montana, right? Because Montana is the least densely populated state in the Union. There's more space and fewer people in Montana than anywhere else in the country. What would 7 million Jews look like in Montana? Oh, there's an elk, there's a mountain, there's a Jew, a big deal, right? Overnight, Montana would become the wealthiest state in the nation, all right? Jews have good business sense, or at least other Jews, not me, but others. And the truth is that it's possible. Why don't they? Because if you want to put a pool in your backyard here in Kingston, whatever, who do you have to call first before you start digging? You have to call the electric company, you have to call the gas company, because you may dig up something that's electric or something. Who do you have to call if you want to put a pool in your backyard in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv? You have to call the Department of Antiquities. Why? Because you're going to dig up something that is 2,000 years old with Hebrew written on it. You are. It's the way it is. They're not going to bring all of the stuff underneath them, previous generations, previous civilizations of Judaism. They can't bring it to Montana. And for whatever reason, that's where they want to stay because of, in large part, the Holocaust. Why can't we just forgive and forget? Why can't we move on? Because memory is crucial. And so is arguing with God crucial. And that's what they did. This is the last story I'll tell you. During the Holocaust in Auschwitz, there were a lot of rabbis that were waiting to die. And these scholars of Jewish history and Jewish tradition put God on trial. And they said, God, you have let this happen. Your chosen people are being slaughtered and gassed and cremated. And they had prosecutors and they had defenders. And at the end, the verdict was ready to be given. Now, it was late in the day, and they were all gathered together, and they said, okay, we have the verdict. The jury is in, we have the verdict, and they were ready to read out the verdict. But it was late in the day, so it was time for the evening prayers, okay? The verdict came through, and the verdict was God is guilty. right? The next thing they did was take out their little prayer books and they started to pray to God, right? Because it was the afternoon prayers, and we have to pray to God. We have to thank God for everything we have, for all the miracles that take place in our lives. And that's what they did. The Holocaust lives on as one of the darkest places in Jewish history. And we've been working at trying to get our numbers back onto something close. I'm doing my fair share. We became a foster family when we moved here. We already had 5 of our own, 5 kids, and we became a foster family, and we've had, about 100, 120 different foster kids, some overnight and some for a long time. 7 of them never went home. So we adopted 7 kids from the community who were from various backgrounds. None of them really had any religion in their lives. Well, they're Jews now. So I've done my share, right? And I keep telling my wife we need our financial tubes tied because we have no more room and no way to support them all. But they're all great, and they all come from different places, different backgrounds, different colors, right? And they're doing it. My daughter, who was born to two African-American parents, biologically, and the drugs just took them over, and it was a terrible situation. We got her at 4 weeks old, and then we had to deal with what do you think was the biggest issue? Oh, no, that was the crying. Yeah, she did cry, but she was adorable, so forget it. I didn't mind that. It was the hair. What did we know about the hair? My daughter ended up, one of my older daughters went to Jolie Academy and learned how to do hair so that she could do Soraya's hair. Soraya is probably going to end up moving to Israel. And she has lived there for a year in a GAP program, and she just wants to go back. That's where she believes. She's not that religious of a Jew, but she identifies first as a Jew. And then as an American, and then as a black woman who knows that when she's walking with lighter-skinned friends through the mall or at a store, she knows she's being watched more closely than the lighter-skinned kids are. She knows it. She knows she's a target. She knows there's racism. She knows that it's not fair. She understands it. But there are other things that she knows too, and wants happiness and joy, and part of that is her Jewish heritage. So we are trying all that we can do to do what we need to do, to be tenacious, to keep moving. So I just want you to know that learning about the Holocaust is the first major step in making sure it doesn't happen again. Thank you.
All right, so thank you to Rabbi Kaplan for his remarks, and to Rebecca, Maya, and Paige for their presentations. My hope is that you will leave this assembly more informed about the Holocaust in particular, and more aware of the blight that the blight of genocide continues to plague the world in a more general sense. And my hope is that you'll be further inclined to consider what ways of thinking lie behind these crimes against humanity, and to consider what role we can all play in preventing these sorts of episodes in the future. So thank you for your attention, and I wish everyone a good weekend.